Welcome again, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at Demos for the Radically Honest Conversation series. Today's Radically Honest Conversation will focus on funding Black and Brown organizations like we want them to win. My name is Carol Lautier, and I'm Associate Director of the Inclusive Democracy Project, a national cohort of mostly grassroots leaders of color who are building power in communities of color across the US. Our hope is that this conversation with today's amazing panel will help move more money to Black and Brown-led organizations and advance racial equity and social transformation that strengthens our democracy. First, two housekeeping items. One, we are recording this event and it will be available for future viewing on Demos YouTube channel. We will also send the link to everyone who's registered in a follow-up email that you'll receive within the week. Lastly, we will have a Q&A portion of this panel, and we invite you to submit questions using the Q&A feature within Zoom at that time. You're also welcome to share comments in the chat throughout this event. At this time, I'm pleased to welcome Demos President Sabeel Rahman. Welcome, Sabeel.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you everyone in the audience, and so thrilled to have this amazing panel of visionary leaders to walk us through this conversation. I just want to take a couple moments to ground us in the moment we're in and the critical need for this conversation. As we all know, we're deep in election season, but not just any election season, one where we're seeing the brazen and terrifying real-time assault on Black and Brown political power in particular. We're at the start of a third wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, which we know is specifically impacting Black and Brown communities as a reflection of the systemic racism baked into our safety net, our economy, our histories of disinvestment, and exclusionary and extractive infrastructure. And we face an ongoing pandemic of racial violence, again, particularly impacting Black and Brown Americans. All of that is the backdrop but also for this incredible moment of mobilization and deep organizing led by Black and Brown leaders, Black and Brown organizations, building what I really believe is the largest, most transformative moment for racial justice in this country. And in previous installments, as Carol mentioned, we've delved into some of those specific battles around political power, around structural racism, the economy. But here we're really looking at our social change infrastructure itself. And if our goal is the creation of a society that dismantles systemic racism, that centers Black and Brown communities and secures the freedom to thrive, and if we believe that change is powered by grassroots movements and by the deep, durable building of power, then what does that mean for philanthropy? What does that mean for all of us engaged in this work? How do we ensure that our commitments to building power and advancing equity outlast any one election, any one campaign, any one candidate, or any one moment in time? That's the kind of things that I hope we'll get into in this panel. So thrilled to learn from the folks we have here. I do want to take just a quick moment to appreciate each of the amazing leaders that you see on your screen. So Brianna Brown, grateful for your leadership at Texas Organizing Project, building power on the ground, Crystal Hayling at Libra and the Frontlines Fund that we're all so excited about to see that change in the field. Vivian Chang and the work at Sandler building, showing the commitment to movement power, and Ashindi Maxton building the Powerful New Donors of Color Network. I can't think of a better group to have this conversation with. And of course, our own Dr. Carol Lautier, who we're so grateful to have as a colleague and thought partner in all of this. So I'll turn it back to Carol and to you all, but just really grateful for your time and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sabeel, and welcome again to our panelists. I'm just going to jump in with a question. So in the last several months, a number of funders have begun to give more money to support Black and Brown-led organizations in response to the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Elijah McClain, and others, the COVID-19 pandemic, political unrest, and subsequent uprisings. There have been a number of historic investments in grassroots organizations, especially those working to educate voters, keep them safe, and protect their votes. I'd like to invite you to introduce yourselves and respond to the following question. In your work, how are you approaching or experiencing the urgent need for funding in this political moment? And I will begin with Ashindi.
All right. I'm Ashindi Maxton. I'm the director of the new Donors of Color Network across the racial community of donors committed to racial justice. And how are we experiencing the need? It's a fascinating moment where there's, sort of a community awash in resources because racial justice got discovered in June 2020 and is polling well. And is popular for the moment. So I think what we're experiencing is a need for organizations to have sustained investment, beyond a faddish moment, and for the investment to go to places where power is actually being built, as opposed to sort of places that check a box for diversity but aren't necessarily changing any games. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for that. Crystal?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Crystal Hayling. I'm the executive director of the Libra Foundation. And I think one of the things that we're really seeing is an awakening in philanthropy that the old ways of doing business aren't working, that business as usual is not acceptable. And so one of the things we're really understanding is that the ways in which we've been funding in very discrete silos with lots of strings attached, with a real sense of distrust. And I say that because so many of us are now engaging in trust-based philanthropy. The suggestion there being that everything else that preceded that has not been trust-based, that's not really working. That's not going to be adequate to the moment. As we all are becoming aware of the fact that our democracy is really at risk here. What are the things that history in this country has taught us help to save our democracy? Well, we know that Black communities have been at the front line of helping to save our democracy repeatedly. And so we need, as funders, to be putting our resources directly there. And that's one of the reasons why we created the Democracy Frontlines Fund, which is a collaborative of a group of foundations that have come together and committed to providing $36 million over 3 years to a slate of 10 Black-led organizing groups that are out there right on the front lines of addressing the issues most importance to saving our democracy, actively engaging in protest, which is a critically important part of how we express our desires and demands about the power building that Ashindi mentioned in communities, and really supporting that and being committed as a group of foundations over time to be in relationship with those 10 organizations. So I think that's what we're really seeing is finding different ways of doing this philanthropy that are really trust-based and that engage us as partners in addressing what needs to happen, as opposed to the old ways of business, which we're really seeing us as kind of being transactional in our relationships with grantees. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you for that, Crystal. Brianna, how are you approaching or experiencing the urgent need for funding in this political moment?
Yeah, I want to thank Demos for having me today. I'm our deputy director with the Texas Organizing Project. We are a power building organization on the ground 24/7, reimagining and remixing the democracy here in Texas. And making sure that our democracy looks like us, feels like us. I often like to tease about, it is a FUBU process. It's interesting, that question that you pose, because I think, with the election just around the corner, there's this frequent kind of boom or bust, right? So election, everyone gets like how high stakes election season is and what's on the line. And there tend to be a flood of like resources, and then it dwindles, and then it comes and it goes, right? But this is a frequent conversation that power building organizations on the ground have every day. I was chopping up with one of our Inclusive Democracy Project cohort members, amazing Tanya Watkins at Seoul, and she talked about like how in 2017 in her application to a pretty radical foundation, she talked about abolition, and the response back to her was like, whoa, wait, I think you might be going a little too fast for us. And it's amazing, to fast forward 3 years, and some of the things that I've already heard people say is how your portfolios are really being informed by this moment. And I agree with Ashindi. I hope that it's not just a fad moment. I certainly see that as part of my job, is to, as an organizer, to continue to push out the corners of what is possible, including in the world of philanthropy. So, the sense of urgency you talked about, that is like an everyday thing, right? For organizations like ours. We know how critically important it is that we are not on a boom and bust cycle because we are working on the front lines, and the stakes in our cities, in our counties, in our states are too high. So I have some optimism, I should say that this moment is going to have some real legs to it. And I'm also optimistic that it can lead to some real transformation in how philanthropy has worked in our sector.
Thank you for that, Brianna. Vivian.
Thanks, Carol and Sabeel, for bringing us together, and to my co-panelists, esteemed and honored to be here in this conversation with you. So my name is Vivian. I'm the executive director of the Susan Sandler Fund. And I want to build on the concept that I heard you, Brianna, Crystal, and Ashindi kind of start to raise, which is the concept of durability. And I think that there are historic examples of what we can see can happen when there is durability. And I think there are present day, current day examples as well. Brianna, I don't want to steal your thunder, and I think you should talk a lot about the work that you've done through TOP. So I'm going to raise two other shining examples of what can happen when there is slow, steady building of power. California, 25 years ago, the policies that were being passed through the legislature and also through the ballot box represented the interests of the economically powerful, older, mostly white generation. It was the birthplace of the anti-immigrant legislation, Prop 187, the anti-affirmative action, Prop 209, the three strikes law, Prop 21. And fast forward through 25 years of steady building of power. And it's not perfect, but the movement is in a place to be able to contest around the repeal this November of the most important tax policy that has starved public education, health and human services, and been in a place to repeal some of the most draconian measures that were passed back in the 90s. Second example, Virginia, very different state, very similar strategy of the steady, slow, steady building of power centered in Black and Brown communities. This legislative cycle in 2020 moved a sweeping set of progressive policies, expanding the access to vote, raising the minimum wage by 30% for almost 1 million people, codifying in state law the reproductive health rights guaranteed through Roe v. Wade, prohibiting the local law enforcement collaboration with ICE, ensuring health insurance plans in the state can't discriminate on health status. So I'm raising those examples because it shows what is possible when you are building durable power, you have durable institutions, and both of those things require durable financing.
Thank you, Vivian. I really appreciate that comment about durable power. And I'm wondering if Ashindi and Crystal, if you have thoughts about how durable power is built through funding in Black and Brown communities, or what you've experienced in your work.
You go first, Crystal.
Sure, I'll go. I think one of the things that is most important is for funders to recognize that giving multi-year support is critically important. General operating support dollars, critically important. Part of what is true is that what we are seeing is when we talk about durability, that durability means having the ability to respond to changes that are happening on the ground in real time. I'm sitting here in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, and when people are talking about startups, one of the things they always talk about is being able to pivot the strategy, pivot the funding, all of those things. We never really talk about that in philanthropy, about the importance of securing that ability in the organizations that we're funding, but it is critically important. So that is what I think is really part of what builds durability, is long long-term funding, general operating support dollars, getting out of the way, sort of not trying to determine what the goals and outcomes need to be from the funder's perspective, but really being in partnership with our grantees around them really leading the way on what needs to happen. Those are some of the things I think that are really critical components to how we ensure that our funding is durable and is supporting the durability of the organizations on the ground.
Thank you, Ashindi.
That's great. I would second all of that. And then I was also thinking about the fact that, the folks on this call are the choir, or you wouldn't be on this call, or you wouldn't have pressed, play on this recording. So I wanted to offer, just a tool for like why we don't fund durable power. Like, how do we get out of it, even though we say, all the right things, which is just a who, what, when, where, why tool of what keeps us from doing it. So the who is, do you know the people who are building durable power? Like, did you know Brianna Brown before she became a national figure? She was still a great organizer. She was already doing really powerful work, but if you weren't in Texas, you didn't know her. So there's a who challenge of like the people who are doing the real legit work in communities, maybe people that you don't see in New York or DC or San Francisco, where most foundations are funded. So you have to actually solve a problem for the who. The when is all the time. And we have funding available during a crisis. We have funding available when, again, racial justice polls well. We have funding around election cycles. And I really am super proud to be in company with Crystal and Vivian, who think about funding all year, in and out of cycle around the power building. But if you get excited when there is a crisis or a moment or a need for a particular community, you are not funding durable power. The why is also hard for, I think, why do we build power for communities of color? Well, if you are a white funder, which most funders are, you are giving up power by giving it to anyone else. So you have to get really profoundly comfortable with the idea of giving up power. And even the folks who I have met who, again, speak really well about this idea, when the rubber hits the road and the decision is actually not yours, or you have to trust a campaign that doesn't look like the one you would have designed, or you have to trust a community that doesn't look like one that's familiar to you, or a tactic that you have never used, the why is actually a part of what is hitting a barrier for you. The where is, again, why didn't you know Brianna before? Because she's in Texas, So I think, just really going through the, and the what, is also really challenging for folks. The tactics may be new, the approach may not fit you. One story I tell often is, meeting Color of Change at a really early stage, when it was basically self-funded by James Rucker, and how he was organizing online was invisible to the funders I worked with at the Democracy Alliance, and it didn't look like a real organization. And so that is actually what I heard when I brought that organization up for funding, was like, it's not a real organization. It's operated out of someone's house. It's, all online. There's no office. And so, that's now an accepted way of organizing. But at the time, in like 2007, it wasn't. So being comfortable with the people who are building power may not be using the strategies that, are familiar to you. And that all of those are things you have to confront really seriously. And the other tool that I would offer if you are trying to fund durable power is something we're working on at Donors of Color, where we've also decided the who matters immensely, like who is making the decisions, and their lived experience is massively important, which is why we took the time to build a community of people with lived experience as people of color with resources. But you can do that in any foundation that you are in or any place that decisions are being made. Look at who's making the decisions and what their lived experience is, and know that it matters. And commit to changing your decision makers to reflect those communities. And then set funding goals for yourself. So we've built these inclusion principles, which you can find on the Donors of Color website. And the inclusion principles say, like, are you spending at least 30% of your resources on communities of color? And I would call that a floor, like the minimum you should be doing. But like, if you're not, then you aren't actually satisfying a condition of basic reflectiveness of funding the communities that you should be funding. Are you diversifying your decision makers? Are you diversifying your board? And then are you being transparent and reporting those things out? So I would say if you are finding yourself in 2020 or anytime, saying all the right words, I would ask if you're using all the tools that you can to be sure that you're actually funding power building and not just, checking boxes that make you feel better.
And Brianna, how do you think about durable power as it relates to funding opportunities that you've experienced? And what would you like to see change?
Well, I want to acknowledge, I think Ashindi was the one who just said the thing about, we're singing to the choir here to a certain extent. And a lot of a lot of what I'm hearing is really encouraging, right? Like the proof is always in the pudding, right? And I think that, there are some real examples of folks that are doing what, so much of our organizing is about, which is trying to enlist real co-conspirators. And to do that, like, you have to tell a story that goes deeper than what happens in this discrete election, whether that's like, a federal election or, as we throw down in school board elections, right? So I think that kind of like recruitment of real co-conspirators that get us at an essential level, like at a DNA level, like what the real aspiration is. I think that, one of the traps that frequently, like we fall into is like having to tell like a really depressing story, right? And it's like that becomes like a real performance, and that is what unleashes the coin, right? Where we have a really big aspirational, inspirational vision for what is possible, and we want to see that funded, right? I believe looking at Crystal was saying this just a second ago, but the kind of reducing the kind of hoops that we have to jump through, there's no reason to require, a 70-page thesis. That's not really a thing, right? That's just an additional hoop. One way that we talk about it is like that the application process needs to be decolonized. And it needs to be something where we can really drive the conversation about like what we're going to deliver and how we're going to deliver it. I mean, I believe I also heard Ashindi talk about that just with like the tactics. And I think this moment that we're in with the pandemic and the Black uprisings has really created a space for innovation of what those tactics look like. I know, the work that we're doing, every day I'm the kind of like requests that, organizers are coming up with. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. Yes, sure, we gotta like target the specific zip code of where this elected is, but online, and realizing that, organizing is changing and wanting the flexibility to be able to be nimble with the times, and not know all the time like what we're gonna need, right? And that be okay. I think that the other way that I think that it's so critical is that this idea of like, we want to be able to exert our own agency. And that is not like a cute little side hustle thing. That is the essence of what our organizing is. And when we are recruiting people to believe in that vision, whether it's funders or communities we're fighting alongside of, it's extraordinarily important that we're able to do those things on our own terms. So, if I were to put anything on a bumper sticker, it would be give large grants. Trust us, require as little as possible, and let us determine, what our deliverables are.
Thank you for that. Yes, Ashindi.
I want to add something there. Thank you so much, Brianna. In terms of force field analysis of like why we don't do better, I think people should examine like, why do you need so much information from Texas Organizing Project? Like, why do you need so much information from Black and Brown led groups, and where's it coming from? And it's hard to confront, but it is coming from a white supremacist place of, we believe we know better than they do what they need, and we can only make a decision if we have taken X-ray vision of every piece of their operations. And I'll tell you, actually, we just experienced this at Donors of Color, where we have some funders and very few white funders, a tiny little number, but then the questions that they are asking us at Donors of Color are immensely different than the people of color are asking us. In terms of the level of detail, the like interest in exactly who is doing what on the staff and exactly what the board looks like and how is the budget structured. And, I'm like, where is this coming from? It's coming from a distrust that isn't named. And so I just would say, name it. Like, if you need infinite information, if you need 70 pages from Texas Organizing Project when they're sitting on the record they're sitting on, where is that coming from?
Yeah, I've heard from a number of partners that the process of even receiving funding can be so onerous. Vivian, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think this conversation is spot on. And, one place that I see that manifests is just like a fundamental disconnect around the essence of the work of power building, right? And I mean, my reflections are that I see so often funders really zero in on a particular metric, right? And in the civic engagement space, it could be the number of voters contacted, the number of whatever, IDs. And the reality is the work of building power, the work that Brianna does and others who are building power, it is about developing the muscle of democracy and collective democracy. And it's bringing people together who might have been formerly incarcerated or recently immigrated, those who are struggling to breathe in their neighborhoods. And it's about building connections with one another, learning to work together, figuring out together how to build the power needed to change the policies. And the magic in that is that people come together and they realize that their life is not an isolated experience, that it's actually a collective experience shaped by racism, corporate power embedded in policies and structures. And so that transformation of a me to we, of a, oh, I actually not only belong here, I have a right to shape the policies that create the conditions of my life. Like, that's the essence of power building. And I just find that there's such a huge disconnect, right? That's different from how many people have you turned out to vote in election, although that's part of it, right? That might be one part of it, but it's such a narrow definition of building power. And so, Brianna, you said something like that I think relates directly to that, which is we are trying to build a powerful base that believe in a collective vision of what your state, our state needs to look like. And so, like, there's just such a disconnect, right, between these things that we call metrics and then the actual essence of and the magic of what is being built in groups like TOP and others.
Thanks so much for that. I mean, what I think I'm hearing is that the process can be onerous, in part because there's a lack of trust and relationship. And what you've just lifted up, Vivian, the disconnect between the metrics, right? The door knocks, the phone calls, the signatures, and the power building work over time, which is actually about relationship building. And so if you were to imagine a process of applying for funds, and folks were primarily funded to like build their base, to actually build deep relationships, what kind of report back would you be looking for? Is there a way to quantify that kind of work?
I'll
for anybody.
a little bit and just say, you know, we at the Libra Foundation, we try very hard to have a process that is as least amount of onerous verification processes as is possible. And so one of the things we do is organizations that receive funding, we take on as the staff a lot of the responsibility of gathering the data about the organizations. A lot of the information is publicly available. We can get on GuideStar and get 990s. We can go to websites and we can look at people's financials from the previous year. We can pull all of that information together without asking folks to show up and produce that for us. We find our pipeline is built by asking the organizations that we're already in relationship with, what is their ecosystem like? What other organizations that we're not funding could you not do your work without? Who are the key partners that matter to you? That's how we find out who the organizations are. That means those groups have already come pre-vetted, right? We've already got some information about them. We can also find out who their other funders are. So we can pick up the phone and call another foundation and say, hey, I see that you've been funding Texas Organizing Project. Tell us a little bit about it. We can do so much of the diligence ourselves without demanding that of the organizations. And so pretty much what we do after we've gathered that information is we call the organization, we tell them that they're under consideration for a grant. We may ask them for one or two pieces of information. We say, if you have an application that you've already submitted to somebody else, just send us that. And that's what our process looks like. And then we ask them to send us the information for where you want the money deposited. We really try very hard, particularly when it's a new organization. We'll give a 1-year grant. And then that first year of funding is how we get to actually know each other better, right? Let's put the money out to the organizations first, and then really get to be in that process of relationship building, right? Because otherwise what we're doing is we're asking organizations to go into debt to even get the money in the first place. They've had to expend hours of time writing a proposal that's unfunded time, right? Let's not do that. So that's one of the things that we also think is really important. In terms of progress reports, we give people the option of sending us reports they've sent to other foundations, sending us something that they think is really critically important. But we also stay in touch with them. We get their newsletters. We get all the information they're putting out. More and more organizations are doing joint funder updates. It's our responsibility to show up for that webinar in which they're updating everybody so that it doesn't have to be personalized to every individual foundation. So those are some of the practices. One last thing I would say too is we really are big supporters of regranting entities, right? There are a lot of organizations out there like Borealis, like Solidaire, like Way to Win, and Way to Lead that are great groups that really fund organizing. And this is another final piece I'll just say. Lots of foundations don't recognize that there are fundamental different skills you need as a grant maker to fund organizing than just to fund services or just to fund the museum. And I'm not in any way deriding those last two. Those are certainly important things, but we've got to actually we've got to upskill ourselves in what it means to be funding organizing. And we can do that in community with others who already have the experience and knowledge.
I love that. Ashindi?
I just love that. I love Crystal Hayling. I'm just so grateful for her leadership. Yeah.
Crystal, you needed to have just dropped the mic after that.
Yeah, I mean, and there just is, I mean, there's almost no one doing that. Like there are a few people doing what Crystal is doing, but at the scale that she's doing it, it's, I mean, it's just, there's almost no one. And it works. I mean, I think that's the thing I would add. I answered a question in the chat about what decolonized funding looks like. And one model I got to help build is the Emergent Fund, which was a project of the Women Donors Network and Solidaire and Threshold Foundation. And you know, we required less than 1 or 2 pages in an application. And what was amazing to me is how good the decision-making was, because what we did was stay in relationship with movement leaders. And I would point that out as something Crystal is doing as well. You can either be doing what most foundations do, which is like gathering paperwork, going over the paperwork, talking to other people in your office who are not in Texas or Virginia or anywhere else that the power is actually being built about what's on the paper. Or you can spend your time being in right relationship with the people who are doing the work, showing up to their briefings, having conversations, you know, being aware of power dynamics, paying people for their time when they brief you, you know, being in relationship with the intermediaries. And that's a different choice every day about how you use your time. And so I would just point to that as an addition to what Crystal was saying. And I would also say that, you know, when we vetted the Emergent Fund, you know, we had an external evaluation done and they wrote a big report. And I was like, there's not enough critical feedback here. And they're like, we can't get anyone to say anything bad about this model. You know, a model in which only 1 to 2 pages are required from the groups and in which funding moves, you know, like pretty much the way Crystal said, like there were no bad decisions being made because we lacked the 70 pages of data, and the groups were grateful. And then I appreciate what Crystal added of like, then you learn if you make some mistakes and, you know, you fund some groups that aren't perfect, cool, now you know, and you keep moving.
Vivian or Brianna, would either of you like to jump in?
I have nothing to add to both of those brilliant responses. What they said, both of them.
It was an interesting question, right? Because, you know, I'm not on that side, but to think about like how could we demonstrate, you know, real power building and that we've built these real relationships now. So I was still like, I hadn't come up with anything, but it does bring up for me just like, again, like the moment that we're living in, and like how our organizing has really adjusted. Like we're not having, like one-on-one conversations in coffee shops or people's homes anymore, right? We're trying to figure out a way to like, still inspire action and create like the deep relationships that sustain a movement after an election, which is so important, right? Like after the, there's no more sensational headlines and the real work begins, it is essential that we have like a base that is moving and driving, a really bold agenda. So I was just trying to think of like, how could we, and actually remembering one application that actually a part of their application is they ask a lot of questions, and for each of them, they want like demonstrations of what power looks like. And, I definitely stayed up in wee hours of a night one time trying to frankly concoct an answer for like, I don't, because I don't know, you know what I'm saying? Some of this stuff is just like, it's an experiment. And sometimes we experiment forward and then sometimes we fall on our face. It was interesting. I heard, Crystal say this earlier, just about like what happens in like technology. It's like, they love to fail forward. They love like a failed experiment, an investment with millions of dollars, and it doesn't work out, but we learned something. And I think that would be really refreshing to have that be the means to an end, is just to experiment, and figure out what works without the fear that comes along with, oh, I got to get this right or else I'm not gonna get funding, so.
I want to build on that because I think that, Brianna, that is a really important point to underscore. And part of what happens when an entire field has been under-resourced forever, and that the funding generally gets tied to some very narrow metrics that are, let's just be clear, that are really difficult it's like challenging to achieve them, right? That part of what happens is that the collective capacity and ability to experiment, to evolve the field, to evolve what it is that you're doing, it gets squeezed, right? It gets squeezed out. And I think that other fields don't experience that, right? And so, so maybe just to add to, Crystal, what you were laying out, which is, and Ashindi, absolutely, general operating, like long-term support, yes, 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 yes. And, there was one grant that we made to basically a collective experimentation around base building effort was Base Lab, and we funded it because our perspective is that so much of we wanted to underscore that people could have the ability to innovate, to experiment. And I just think that's a really important, the whole context under which we do our power building has changed, like the political landscape, the technological background, the platforms, all of that. And there's certain things about organizing and base building that will be evergreen, but there's so much that has changed that both may require us to shift our strategies, but also potentially models of organizing and models of base building. And so where's the funding for that? Like dedicated funding for that, not in addition or in substitution with the general operating, but on top of.
I really appreciate Vivian and Susan Sandler for funding experimentation. And I would say, Francis Conner there asked this question about risk-taking in the Q&A. And it's a privilege to fail. It's a massive privilege to fail. And most people of color don't get it. We have to be flawless to keep getting funded, and particularly to keep getting funded at scale. In terms of experimentation, well, I'll go back to, I was a consultant for many years. And one of the things that every client that I had would say to me is, essentially like they'd ask me to solve a problem. And then what they always actually wanted to hear is that they could solve the problem by doing more of what they had already done. Like, that's what everybody wanted to hear. It's like, if you just keep doing what you're doing, but more of it, like you will have a different answer. And it just never was the answer. And so nobody was ever comfortable with like, do this completely different thing. It's just because change is hard for people. It just is. There's a learning curve. I got used to there being like blowback with an initial, like, yeah, what you're doing isn't going to get you there. Like, it won't actually solve the problem. And I feel that way about all of our movements. And the failure to be inclusive in our funding has created massive failures that are related to a lack of experimentation, of continuing to do the same things and hoping we'll have a different outcome. So I would look at the climate movement, which has so unbelievably disproportionately funded white funders or white organizations. And then you look at like, what is the system that got us into this climate crisis? You know what? It was led by white men. Like, they built this system, and we are funding them to actually get us out of it. We're not funding Indigenous leaders. We're not funding Black leaders. We're not funding Native leaders. And if we do, it's at tiny scale. So one thing Donors of Color is doing, I know our climate advisor, Danielle Dean, is on this call, is we are getting close to launching a campaign specifically to get the top climate funders to move more of their resources into communities of color, not because it's the right thing to do, it's the right box to check, but because we are failing the planet and ourselves and our kids by not resourcing the right leaders and letting them experiment and letting them try things that haven't been done. Because the thing that's going to save us is not the thing we've already been doing. So I would just say, like, any work you're in, also if you're someone who's making the case to funders to fund communities of color, is to really make the case of, if you want a different outcome, you're going to have to trust people to do something new that you haven't seen. There's no other way to actually get to any place.
Thank you for that. I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts about perhaps what would you say are one or two of the most important shifts, like cultural shifts, mindset shifts, that are needed in philanthropy to better support Black and Brown-led organizations?
I'll jump in with one thought. I think one of the things that has to change in philanthropy, and one of the reasons why I really want to build off of what we've just been sharing, particularly Vivian and the work that they've been doing, is really starting to shift the narrative in philanthropy about what our success looks like. What does it mean for us to be successful as foundations? We have really had a very old story that isn't working anymore, as Ashindi was just pointing out, right? So, so many times, one of the things that we have looked at is a large systemic inequity, say in education, or a large systemic problem like environment and climate change. And we have, instead of looking at what would it take to create a systemic intervention, like understanding a power analysis, instead, what we've done is looked at how can we pluck individuals out of this terrible system and hopefully get a few more people who are able to succeed, right? So this kind of the illusion of the meritocracy, which is sort of a really important part of a lot of philanthropy, that, we're just getting everybody equal opportunity. And if we just do that at the individual level, that's going to create this systemic change that's going to address kind of overall inequity and inequality. That doesn't work. And yet we keep trying to do more and more and more of that. So I think it really is important for us to change the narrative about what successful philanthropy looks like as well. And that is an important part of the work that we're doing. And we're seeing more foundations, individuals, as well as foundations that are, not just family foundations, but others. But I think it's really important to see us shifting what we think success looks like. And that's an important part of this.
Thank you for that, Crystal. I'm wondering, Brianna, if you could talk a little bit about, in your experience, has there been a drop off in funding after a period of crisis? And I think for some of us, 2020 has been one long challenge. And so there's been increased funding in this period and some question about, whether that will persist beyond November 3rd. in terms of how philanthropy has responded to crises, how would you like that to change, or has it been most effective?
Yeah, well, maybe because I wanted to get in on a little bit of that last question, and maybe it dovetails with what you're asking, because from our end, I think that at top we have, I got to count, I don't know, 4 different organizations to be able to do the kind of gymnastics we need to be able to do to be in the receiving end of getting money, and I know that has to do with IRS designations, but I don't know how it's a curious question to me, just how well people philanthropy is seeing that whole picture, right, of what kind of holistically investing in an organization really looks like. And we get Michelle, also our ED, gets endlessly tired with the constant kind of negotiating between and among the different organizations. And whenever I think about what we're bringing in, I'm thinking about okay, so this is the majority of our budget is spent on our personnel, which means that we got to make sure we got good health care, right? We got to make sure that a parent can get braces for their kids. We got to make sure that there is a 401k plan that people can be investing in their futures. We need an admin team that is going to be helping to make sure books are in order, a finance team that is top notch. We need to be able to recruit the talent and sustain the talent. So I think that there should be a fuller conversation that's going on in philanthropy about what it looks like to fund our staffs, right? What it really takes to make sure that everyone has a dignified job and is coming to a dignified workplace. And that's one of those, it goes to part of the conversation that was happening before about general support dollars, because that's how you sustain position. That's how you sustain the movement, right? It's we need to be able to have staff that is in it for the long term, and that they are being compensated for the amazing work that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. So Carol, your question just for me goes back to that kind of boom or bust, right? So whether it's election season or there's a crisis going on, in Texas, we are no stranger to hurricanes. We have been down in Harris County, where Houston is. We've been hit by hurricanes of biblical proportions, literally, that have transformed the workings of that county. The easy answer to your question, is yes, that happens, right? Crisis hits and people are feeling particularly altruistic, and faucets, are turned on, and we're able to do some new things. Following Hurricane Harvey, it was really amazing. We were able to come together with other organizations and build a fund that was all about organizing. And we were one of the few organizations that were in the streets with a 20-person canvas team, having good conversations with folks, trying to understand the need, the immediate need, right? Do you have a blue tarp on your house? Is water still coming in? Do we need to help you remove the mold that is growing? Those kind of things. And then trying to figure out how is it that our communities, that Black and Latino communities that so frequently are the last folks considered when it comes to reinvestment money, are in the front of the line. And one of the things through our organizing that included both a sophisticated campaign plan and building real political power, so we could flip that county commissioner court so that we could put so that the way money was flowing can have a racial equity lens, and Black and Latino families could be first in line to get those reinvestment dollars. That work is a sprint, and it's a sprint to both meet the immediate need of what is going on in our communities. And it's also a sprint because we have, but so much money to do it with. You know what I'm saying? Like, we have this kind of like finite, discrete amount of money to do this work. So I think what we're able to do, has been, historically impacted by, what we're able to raise. And what we're able to raise has been impacted by, what's going on in our world. So, I mean, I will reiterate this again. I'm gonna put this is the bumper sticker. Give large grants, trust us, require as little as possible. I really do think that is like a prescription to some of what you're, that kind of boom and bust, whether why that happens, right? Elections, crises, there's no reason that that our work needs to be at that rhythm.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I also appreciate you lifting up, the need to pay your people well, 401ks, health insurance. And I'm wondering if, how easy or challenging is it for these Black and Brown-led organizations, grassroots organizations, to get like general operating support, just to be able to do some of the basic work of having a stable organization?
I'll jump in with one thought about that. I think that there's a question in the chat box about how to get foundations to be less focused on sort of numerical outcomes. And this is, sort of that piece about the, general operating support is to say that we are in alignment with our overall vision and goals and mission with this organization. Our foundation is in alignment. That's when you give general operating support. When you worry that you're not in alignment, then you start going into let's identify these particular outcomes that you're going to produce for us. We are not hiring these foundations to achieve certain things on our behalf. We are partnering with organizations in order to achieve the goals that the community has for itself. That's the difference, right? And I also want to just say, we talk a lot about foundations giving up power, but there is also something really profound that you gain when you enter into trust-based relationships. So many times what foundation folks feel like they have to do is put their heart in a box and get out their calculator. And somehow or another, that's going to result in some amazing social change. It is not. You can take your heart out of the box, right? You can say, I don't know how we're going to get to racial equity and justice in this country. Maybe I can be in relationship with people who can tell me how. It is a profoundly beautiful thing when what we have all experienced over the last year has been our hearts breaking in so many ways, whether it was around George Floyd's murder, whether it is around 545 children whose parents cannot be found. Let us be in that broken heart. Let us use that to catalyze the action that we're going to take together. That is something we in philanthropy, that is an opportunity and a privilege we can walk into and not walk away from. And that is what I think we can also say. It's not just giving up power, but it is actually an offer, an opportunity to walk into community.
Thank you for that, Crystal. And just so our viewers know, we're going to begin the Q&A in 4 or 5 minutes. And I see that some of you have already posted questions. But as we close out this portion, I know a number of funders are in the audience today, and I'm wondering if this is for all of our panelists. Is there anything that you'd like to say to this audience about funding Black and Brown-led organizations in the current moment and beyond? Or are there resources or tools you'd recommend to funders who are grappling with the issues we've discussed today?
Can you say that last part again? I lost just the last sentence.
Thank you. Or are there resources or tools you would recommend to funders who are grappling with the issues we've discussed today?
Well, I think that they should use Ashindi's who, what, when, where, why. I was like ferociously taking notes. I was like, who, what? Oh, me. I was like, oh, the who is me. I mean, I thought that that was a really great, like, kind of like proxy, right? To like help people be thinking about, you know, the questions they need to be asking whenever they're, you know, making these, you know, decisions. I'll just say that.
And I've just chatted our inclusion principles from Donors of Color again. So we have used these inclusion principles both actually on the political side, where we were in a partnership with the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee around their spending on communities of color. And so they agreed to be in partnership with us and spend 30% of their resources elevating candidates of color and talking to people in communities of color. And that was on the political side. And then we are applying these same inclusion principles on the climate side. I would tell you pushback we get to the inclusion principles are things like, well, why 30%? Or, you know, what if like I do international funding and so does like Black, you know, does Black and brown led like apply, or, you know, like make them work, like know a number. You know, our climate advisor, you know, says like, know your number, like what is your percentage that goes to, you know, people of color led organizations, or however you define funding to, you know, communities that are typically not resourced, and then know your number and change it, like track it. Track who's on your board, track who's in decision-making positions, like be really transparent about it and don't settle.
Vivian?
Yeah, I'll just lift up, I think Ashindi's framework of the who, what, where, when, why is great. I want to also just lift up what Crystal shared earlier, which is that if you are looking for a place to start, the pooled funds, there's some great pooled funds out there that provide a, they provide a forum, one, to get to know the field if you feel like you don't know it very well or want to know it better. And they also can be forums to learn. Like, you know, I think one of the biggest questions, just to bring it back around to what we started at the beginning of this hour, is what is it going to take to generate durability? And I think every foundation needs to actually question that. And the answer is going to be different. Every foundation has got a different set of parameters and a different set of people who are all distinct. And so I certainly don't feel like I could answer. I mean, Susan and I talk about this all the time. It's like, what do we need to do to create more durability around funding the organizations that we feel committed to? And I think that part of the question right underneath that is, what are the shifts that that need to be investigated and interrogated? And I feel like the funds that Crystal is providing leadership to, the Democracy Frontlines, that is built to be a learning opportunity. And not just a webinar, 2 hours, pop in, pop out, but over an arc of several years. So that's, again, pooled funds can be a really great way if you are just starting to get to know the field, to be in conversation, to learn together. Again, with that broader question of what shifts need to happen to generate durability. If what we want are durable power and durable institutions.
Thank you. Crystal or Brianna?
I'll throw out one other thought. Thank you so much, Vivian. I think 100% again, and Ashindi. And I also think that, you know, part of what we as institutional funders can do is that general operating support also allows organizing groups to begin to build their fundraising for a broad base of donors. Right? No, we can't have durability, even if we give multi-year support, which we should. Organizations that are doing power building work cannot survive for the long haul with only a few large individual donors or foundations as their base. And there is inherent in the organizing work that desire and that essence of democratizing the support as well. right? There are people out there who are supporting the Texas Organizing Project for whom the contribution that they're making represents a very large percentage of their income, right? They are there's working people out there who are writing checks, who are putting dollars into the organizations that are fundamentally about asking them how to be engaged in a change process. And that is really where a lot of support and fundraising ultimately will also be. So I think that's the other part of this, is being able to recognize that we are providing some base that allows for a democratization of the funding over time. And that also creates a durability, because there's a relationship between funding and the work. And that's what you look at amazing organizations like Brianna's that are really making that into a live, actual laboratory of work and support.
Well, thank you all. I'm going to start some of the questions from our audience. The first is, as more, not enough, but more funding is moving to support Black-led organizing, much of it is going to national or statewide groups. Do you all have any suggestions about spaces or initiatives where funders can learn more about and establish connections with the small, more local Black-led organizing groups that need to be supported long-term in order to consolidate work at the base? And any of you could jump in for that.
I just got off a call from the Association of Black Foundation Executives. They are tracking funds that are being created around Black-led groups all over the country. They would be a fantastic resource. I know here in California, there's the creation of the Black Power Fund. Is that the name of it? Is that the right name? That is being developed by Nicole Taylor and many others. That is phenomenal. That will be providing people with a real, just a phenomenal compass on how to fund Black-led organizing around the state of California at the local as well as statewide level. There are lots of resources out there. I think any of us on this call could also provide some other additional, and we can put some things, Carol, up on the site or, after, when people are going forward with other resources. But I would highly recommend, there are lots of folks, justice funders, folks in the field that could point you towards some of these groups that can say, here's how you fund local Black-led, BIPOC-led organizations. And also just to say too, those groups are also doing a phenomenal job of helping us understand the linkages, right? So, when I say Black-led organizing, I really mean Black-led organizing, but I'm also very aware of the fact that those organizations are really in deep relationship with Latinx, with Indigenous, with Asian Pacific Islander, that work is fundamentally not about excluding, but is about including and building community and relationships. So I just do also want to say that, that's a really important part of this work as well.
Couple more things I point to. I like the intermediaries idea, and there weren't all these intermediaries 10 years ago, and so I would say this is progress in the field. That there is a place to go that there didn't used to be. Like if you really care about the South, or if you really care about Texas, or if you really care about people of color, there are places to go. A couple I'd add to the list. Crystal mentioned Way to Win for folks who are doing political work. Donors of Color has its own collaborative fund, the Power Fund, which is Black and Brown organizing in 6 key states. There's the Emergent Fund that I mentioned before, which is rapid response organizing needs. That money moves really quickly, like $25,000 grants that often have a less than a month turnaround. With very little paperwork and movement-led decision-making, both on the Emergent Fund and the Power Fund. The other thing I would say for folks who don't want to go through intermediaries, well, one is why, because there's a trust relationship there. So, can you make the trust to go through an intermediary where you don't have the expertise? But second, if you don't want to go through an intermediary, then you need to ask yourself, what is the representation of the communities that we want to fund in our decision-making process? And so somewhere among your decision makers, you need to make sure that you are including people with lived experience in those places, or you're going to miss things. So I would again take people back to the who is making your decisions, who's asking the questions, and how can you change them.
Thank you. This question says, as a consultant to foundations, I struggle with the fixation on evaluation and the big dollars going to evaluators that absorb time and energy when those dollars could go so much further on the work. How do we make a case to not be so focused on measurable outcomes?
We're all looking at each other. Okay, I'll bite. Maybe it really is about like, what are you trying to do? What's the change you're trying to make? And is it really captured in a number? So I ask broader questions, have deeper commitments. I would take like the beautiful thing that Crystal said about, like putting away your calculator and opening your heart. That is a good place to be. That is a value add. It feels better, and you actually get to better answers. And this is, again, I think something communities of color have to lend to philanthropy. Like, this is something we can contribute of. There is a different way of analysis that doesn't involve spreadsheets as, at its core. There is another way to ask questions. And so assuming that, the only one that matters can be captured in a spreadsheet is itself coming from a dominant framework. So, open up your frameworks and believe that you can actually get to better answers and, have deeper conversations about what are you trying to do? What changes are you trying to make? Because if you're actually trying to build power, for example, somewhere like Texas, or Virginia or Colorado or Maine or New York or California, you actually just need to be in deeper relationship with the people who are doing that. And that's going to lead you to the right places. And I'll make one other case, like thinking about Texas, which could change the whole electoral map this year, could change everything. And you know what would have changed Texas sooner is more funders in close relationship with people in Texas, who would have had more imagination about the fact that there are so many people in Texas communities who are not voting because the system doesn't engage them. And so the lack of imagination came from a lack of relationship, that therefore we didn't build the power that could have flipped every outcome you care about. And so, that isn't captured in the spreadsheet in the way you might want to, but it would have been captured in relationships that we haven't prioritized building.
Yeah, thank you, Ashindi, for I'm frequently shouting out 38 electoral college votes until we abolish the electoral college, that is. They really, changed the whole game. And it's certainly how, the biggest picture is how that we take on every day at TOP is how do we reimagine our world? Oh, how do we imagine the United States? Oh, Texas has to transform, right? It's so goes Texas. But I just want to give a couple examples of, I have no idea. We have definitely put this in grant reports, but I cannot point to the thing that created it, right? So in the city of Houston, Amazon was looking for a big tax abatement, and it was right before Christmas. And of course, their timing was very strategic that way. We got wind of it and, started organizing. We're actually successful. A whole campaign called Scamazon, very creative, right? And they ended up not getting the tax abatement. And to our knowledge, that was the first time that, that had happened in the South, right? That we were able to win that. So fast forward, months later, when we were kind of doing the, kind of postmortem, we had asked for a FOIA request from the city. And they finally got it to us. And one of the emails that we found was one that said, between city council employees, kind of bureaucrats. Okay, wait, what are we going to do about TOP? Right? What is TOP going to think about this? What is our plan to neutralize TOP in this conversation? Essentially, that was the thrust of it. And it was wait, what? So we had no idea that there was this kind of inter-dialogue, that was going on. And I have no idea what at that point, 7 years we had been in the game building power in the city of Houston had resulted in these kind of street level bureaucrats exchanging this email, right? That was we got to account for TOP. I don't know, and it's hard to draw the straight line to how we got there and deliver that in a way that you can fund. But I can guarantee you that Like all the times that our folks turned out at city council and commissioners courts, all the times we went to people's houses, flyered their neighborhoods, like all the tactics that we used led to that moment. I mean, I also think about in the city of San Antonio, there've been a couple times now that we've been on the front page of the San Antonio Express. That's pretty big, right? Like that's changing a conversation. The first time we were, it was like top political power, how top became a political powerhouse. And it was like, wait, what? We didn't, it's like, huh? We became a political powerhouse and it's on the front page of this newspaper. So I think that I'm just thinking with that question, as you know, someone who's on the ground organizing, I can think of a lot of examples like that, where there's not like a B, C, D, this is how you do it. But really what it is that we need to do all of it all the time, right? We need to be able to, you know, at top, we talk about fighting with two fists, people power and political power. We need to be able to do that all the time. And in a way that can result in front pages of newspapers and, you know, inner office exchanges that thwart the process and help us win ultimately. So that thing about what Ashindi was saying, just about imagination, and we need to like inspire people to have a big imagination. That is certainly true when it comes to funders and philanthropy, about how we go about doing our work and what our deliverables are.
Thanks, Brianna. Yeah.
See right there, Brianna? See right there, Brianna? Those stories make it so clear the impact that you are having and the power that you have built. And I feel like, you know, just to come back to like so many times, whatever metrics we think we're tracking are misaligned with actually the essence of what we think we're funding. Like that's a perfect example. And, you know, the only thing I just have to add to this particular conversation around evaluation and big dollars going to evaluators, I do think, I mean, we've had conversations at the fund and the broader Sandler Foundation about, and being super wary within our foundation, but also within the field of like over architecting, like so much gets way over architected. And it's everything from the, you know, grant application process to now the evaluation. It's just, you know, and I think that's a whole other conversation around why. I do think it does come back to this piece around trust. But there is this tendency, and I do think a question that we need to be relentlessly asking ourselves is, you know, what do we really need to know before we make that grant? And, you know, I think that's like a good, like, it's kind of like who, what, when, where, why, and do we need that?
Thanks, Vivian. Our next question says, BIPOC communities are often lauded for their resilience. However, this is a response to oppression and trauma. How can we move away from the idea of building up resilience and talk about shifting power? How can we more easily give communities what they need without the impression that they need to, quote unquote, work for it?
I mean, I said earlier that, you know, so many times I feel like, you know, it's about like that we have to tell a story of desperation instead of like inspiration. And that to me is like that kind of like performance, that kind of, you know, like the performance of like resilience. I believe that was part of, you know, the word that was used in that like question. So I'm certainly here for, all like grant applications that, you know, are really asking us to dream big and to help inspire our folks to action, ballot box in the streets, and not having to rely on, you know, the trauma, the pain, the heartache that is, you know, a part of our experience, but that's not the entirety.
I really do think all roads lead back to what we have been talking about, which is general support grants. And I just feel like this is an example of it. Like, give meaningfully, a meaningful amount, give general operating. And, you know, if this is a year, like Susan and I knew this was going to be a year. And so we gave substantial bumps up to everyone. In some cases, it was a one-to-one bump up from their base grants. I know Crystal did that as well. There are lots of really good examples of that. And, you know, and that money is meant to allow organizations to be nimble. It is about funding that is about taking care of their staff without needing to ask for, we need some restoration funds. Like, just build it up front. So again, I do think all roads lead back to general support.
I think it's so great that you and Susan did that, Vivian. And Brianna, I really love the idea of imagination as like a remedy to resilience. I thought this was a really great question, and I didn't immediately, you know, come up with an answer, but I do really like, you know, stop asking us to be like so like good at trauma and ask us to dream and, you know, think bigger. And then I would actually say one of the things we've been thinking about at Donors of Color is how to put more support into the thought leadership space. And that, you know, the situation we're in, it's kind of that, like, you know, what caused 9/11, like a failure of imagination. Like, it's like, what caused the situation we're in? Like, we didn't have enough space to really imagine something different than where we're at. And, you know, it's not just that we want to like win an election and save democracy as we've known it, and save, you know, climate so we can continue to live exactly the way that we are currently living, but that we can take this crisis and say, what's on the other side of it that is inclusive, that is different, that, you know, actually makes America great for those of us for whom it has never been great. You know, that like, but that space, like that requires time and space and thought leadership that we almost never get the space to have. You know, like we are producing constantly. Like I find that personally, like in a very privileged position that I'm in, you know, to lead a donor network, I still find very little space, you know, in which I don't have to just produce, but have time to just imagine and think. So whatever it looks like, you know, I don't actually have the answers, you know, is it more fellowships? Is it more, you know, general support that just creates more space for somebody like Brianna or Michelle Tremio? Is it, but I think just honoring, you know, the space for people to think and write and be thought leaders and imagine past the crisis.
I'll also say too, I think that some of the things that as foundations we've often, you know, just contorted ourselves in to try to get to happens rather organically when people get general operating support. You know, we've talked for decades about collaboration. You know, you look at a project like the Movement for Black Lives, which is, you know, it is a table of slightly less than 200 organizations working together that have developed policy goals, that have organized, you know, mass collective actions that are really moving as a network, as an ecosystem. And yet, for decades, philanthropy has funded these really broken models of we're going to pay somebody to be the hub and create all these spokes of collaboration, and you know, and most of that doesn't work, right? But given the opportunity to have the resources to dream that Brianna was just talking about, to have the resources to look out to each other and say, let's get this group of leaders together for a dinner, kind of pre-COVID, or whatever, or a call that says, we're all working on the same thing. How are we going to divide this up in a way that makes sense where we're all moving farther together? That's the kind of stuff that happens when people have the ability to have that general operating support. That is an organic collaborative ecosystem building work that happens that we have tried to engineer in lots of very directive and transactional ways previously in philanthropy, most of which has not worked.
Yeah.
And another question we have comes from someone who works for a foundation that supports a wide range of direct service organizations, and they're currently moving towards supporting organizing and power building. And their question is, what what questions can we ask of direct service organizations that would shed light on their approach to addressing racial and class inequities in the work they do? Vivian, would you like to try that or take a, yeah.
Sure. This is a great question. I mean, I might start, and every organization is different. I might start simply with the question of how they see, what is the strategy to actually address the root causes of the challenges they're really trying to support people with, and just see what their answer is. As someone who grew up and was trained in the craft of organizing and power building, and that is explicitly what we fund, I believe so deeply in that. The structural change that we are looking for will not happen unless there is a powerful base of people who are closest to the pain, leading that effort. So I believe so deeply in that. And we're also in this moment when the needs of our community are unprecedented. And when you just look at the numbers around what families are having trouble putting food on the table and a roof over their heads and kids in school in a remote time period, the needs are pretty sharp. And curious about perspectives of my other panelists. I think I have seen some tremendous examples of direct service organizations, one that has figured out how to integrate in power building strategies. And in one case, for example, like a health clinic, actually just on the regular registering clients who come through their doors seeking medical care. It might be an example like that, and or examples of organizations that are in deep, deep alignment with other organizations that do build power, right? Because if you're an entity that's really, your superpower is supporting folks who are right on the verge of losing their homes and being homeless, that's like a certain superpower. That's a particular set of skills and capacities, which are not incompatible from the skills and capacities of building power, not incompatible, but they are different. And so what does it look like in this time period for everyone to be leaning into their superpowers, because it's all needed, and building deep alignment and strategy? So that's a bigger conversation. I would start with just asking the question of, for those direct service organizations, what do they see as the root causes, and what might be some deeper structural solutions that would eliminate kind of what that organization is put in the position of doing, which is trying to address symptoms of a much deeper set of forces and inequities in our society.
Thank you, Vivian. And the person who asked the question says thank you as well in the chat. So we have 5 minutes left, and I would love to hear if you have closing thoughts about how funders might shift, or if there's a call to action you might make, but would love to just hear any final thoughts you have on this topic, or perhaps a hope you have for this work going forward. And I will start with Ashindi.
All right. I think I'll just go back to think about who your decision makers are and what their lived experience is. Really spend a lot of time and energy on that. And I would say, think about trust. And I would go back and emphasize one more time what Crystal said about put away your calculators and open your heart in making these decisions. It's a win-win, and you can do really effective grant making that way.
Thank you, Ashindi. Brianna?
Well, it's interesting because from my vantage point, it seems so easy, right? Hello, just fund us to do the amazing work that we do. And, that is certainly a collective we, there is an amazing network of, power building organizations across this country. that are struggling with the same kind of tensions, right? That we are like leaning on one another to, understand and navigate together. I think that this moment creates, I do wonder, what is there a call of action that philanthropy writ large is making of themselves about like, how will this unprecedented moment that we are all experiencing fundamentally change the way, that funding happens, and sets a new course. I mean, I think that this is the opportunity to do it. If you needed a hook, right? If you needed a reason, I feel like this political moment, this social moment that we are experiencing is the perfect opportunity. So I'll end with a bumper sticker, because guess what? I've gone through media training before. That's one of the many trainings. So folks need to give us what? Large grants. They need to trust us and require as little as possible, and make sure that like whatever the deliverables are, that the folks who are on the ground, driving the strategy are also able to drive, what those deliverables are.
Thank you for that, Brianna. Large grants, trust us, low lift. Okay, we got it. Crystal and Vivian.
Yeah, I think this is exactly right. I love that, Brianna. We really can use this time in our history to do a big reset on philanthropy, right? There's a way for us to make this a course correction. And I think we really desperately need to do that. And I've said before, and I'll say it again, sometimes it has felt for years, I've been in this business for a lot of years, like we are kind of in the business of funding a kinder, gentler suffering. That is no longer adequate. We actually now have to be thinking about what it takes to fund liberation. COVID-19 has taught us nothing if not the fact that we are all interrelated. We all want to feel liberated. We all want to be able to walk outside without a mask on. We all want to be able to hug all of our family members and friends. And we can't do that as long as we think that all choices are only our individual ones. We have to, liberation requires that we be in this together. And so that, I think, is the great reset of philanthropy. There's not two sides to the table. We've got to be in this revolutionary partnership together, to get us all access to healthcare, to get us all access to decent housing, to get us all a livable wage. And those are the things that are going to lead to us having a more equal society. And for all of us being able to do all those things, that liberation that we want, together.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I will build off of that and say that if we believe the fight for liberation is a long-term arc, then we need to be committed to funding durable power, which requires durable institutions and durable funding. And so my call to action is for all of us, like what would it take to create durability within your funding institution? What would it take?
Well, thank you all so very much. It's been wonderful to talk with you. Thank you to our audience. But my biggest thanks, of course, to Vivian and Brianna, Ashindi, Crystal. And I hope that this has been a useful conversation for our audience. We look forward to your feedback. You'll receive an email in about a week with some invitations to comment on this session. And we look forward to being with you again at our next Radically Honest conversation. Thank you all.